The Scottish Government has an opportunity for a new economic direction, and the key is to focus on resilience. Now, since the COVID-19 pandemic, it's become increasingly obvious to everyone that our economy is built on fragile foundations. Now, one of the main reasons is that we now have an economy that focuses on only one thing, on being efficient. Now, this desire for efficiency, above all else, has created an economy that is not resilient. As English social activist William Morris asked in the 19th century, how many lives have been rendered useless and compelled to produce pointless and destructive goods at ever higher levels of efficiency? Sure, our economy must be efficient, but it must be effective at solving our most challenging problems, and it must also be just. Our new economy has to be more resilient. Now, we all know the stories about the impact of a lack of resilience. The government stopped storing PPE to save money, so we were terribly prepared when a pandemic arrived. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we were immediately affected by an increase in gas prices, as our governments had decided that stockpiling such an important asset was not efficient. Prices rose so high and so quickly because the UK institutions had prioritised corporate profits over our cost of living. Now, I need to clarify one thing. Profits are resilient in the UK economy. Our institutional design ensures that. Now, despite producing more oil and gas than we use in Scotland, we pay prices based on international markets. There's no domestic supply shielded from international markets because that would place our domestic supply outside of the market. And this is a cardinal sin in a system designed solely for efficient allocation. Now, over the last 4 decades, we've opened our doors to foreign capital. This has left us celebrating small wins when we're lucky enough to find the scraps in the supply chain for major infrastructure and energy contracts. We import so many of our goods that any disruption to global supply chains will soon increase the prices we see in our shops. This leaves Scotland too vulnerable to too many areas out with our control. We also lose resilience when we entrust almost all of our important infrastructure to investment managers or foreign-owned private equity firms. This ensures that decisions about our most essential assets are made on our behalf rather than by us. Now, in typical forthright fashion, economics professor Mark Blyth puts many of these general issues in a Scottish context.
Stop. You don't own any of that. So how do you improve the thing that you don't own and you don't control? Start there. Right? If you don't own your energy infrastructure, if it's owned by E.ON, if it's owned by your energy infrastructure is owned by asset managers, like everybody else's is owned by Macquarie in Australia, right? So how are you going to improve that when you don't even own it, and you've no capacity to buy it?
See, and that's the thing. All of this is by design. Our institutional setup does not make for a resilient economy. Now, in many ways, this is similar to other countries, but most countries are responding to this new world order by attempting to make their economies and their societies more resilient. Now, this has been China's strategy for decades. Russia has been forced down this route. If we look at the USA and the EU, they've both passed legislation designed to kickstart homegrown industrial strategies to develop and protect essential industrial areas. Now, even a small nation like Iceland, which is very well protected in terms of energy security, focuses much more on food security than we do. Now, these concepts of food, technology and energy security are still foreign bodies to the policymakers in Hollywood. Now, part of that reason is the economic advice they receive. For decades, we've relied on one school of economics, a neoclassical, neoliberal framing that holds that markets and the price mechanism can solve all of our problems. And by relying on global markets, we're never far away from everything that we need. Our policymakers suffer from groupthink, and there is a lack of alternative voices regarding our economy. Now, this significantly hampers any approach to creating a resilient economy. Now, over the coming months, we will examine policy areas that must be addressed to create a resilient economy. But first, we need to do some groundwork. The starting point is to abandon the idea that economic growth solves all of our economic issues. The decades of around 2% GDP growth have not just covered up the cracks in our society, they've made things worse. And that level of debt-fueled, consumer-led growth is over for global north countries. So all we have now are politicians acting like dogs and chasing their tails. Now, economists from Herman Daly to Kate Raworth have said that focusing on growth has allowed policymakers to avoid the more pressing concerns of redistribution, and that can happen no longer. As I laid out in a series of articles for The National, link in the comments below, the geopolitical position dampens Scotland's chance for GDP growth. The Scottish Government doesn't have the levers, and Scotland's economy can only grow if London supports that growth. And to that end, Holyrood and London are looking for growth in all the wrong places. I have argued that achieving significant GDP growth is not only an impossible dream, but also damaging to our society and our economy. So I maintain that our policymakers in Holyrood must now focus on a resilient economy. The good news is that a lot can be done to redress the problems of our economy, rebalance the benefits and redistribute them. While we wait for Scotland to become independent again, the Scottish Government can and must focus on making Scotland more resilient. So what do I mean by making Scotland more resilient? Well, the better known definition of resilience is the ability to return to the current state after a shock. Kind of bounce back ability, I suppose. Alternatively, resilience can be defined as the magnitude of disturbance that can be absorbed before the system changes its structure. And this is much more relevant as we discuss Scotland's economy. In this sense, resilience is very much a systems concept, and I like to use what Donella Meadows, one of the authors of the Limits of Growth report for the Club of Rome, and a leading systems design thinker, said about resilience. The ability to self-organise is the strongest form of system resilience. A system that can evolve, can survive almost any change by changing itself. In other words, our power to be resilient comes from our ability to organise, effect and exert as much control over the system as possible. Now, when you think of it this way, it's not too difficult to see clearly that Scotland lacks this form of resilience. Our institutional design, from the power given to markets to the overarching role of interest rates set by the Bank of England, ensures we lack the ability to self-organise, to change our systems to avoid shocks and disturbances. To observe the lack of resistance, just look out the window. We already see the negative impacts of climate change as sodden fields lead to failed harvests and flooded homes. Changing global power dynamics play out in our TVs and in our shopping baskets, and we seem powerless to respond. But what is the response in Holyrood? Well, I think it's better than in Westminster for sure, but at the moment it's very easy to argue that we have a business as usual administration in Holyrood. Growth is still the thing they chase, as if the world that policymakers were born into is still the world of today. Now, a climate emergency has to be something more than a catchphrase. So in considering Scotland's resilience, our economy is in a similar position to many other small global north economies. Decisions made by our largest neighbours and other large countries across the globe really affect our economy. As a small open economy, we are buffered by global shocks more than many other larger nations. We do not have a large enough internal market to provide all of the goods and services needed to thrive in a modern economy. Now, the size of our economy and Scotland's population, one of the slowest growing in the whole of the global north, are things I would like to return to another time. Our population is also ageing, and far too many of our brightest and best still leave the country. Now, we also have to overcome some serious hurdles as part of the UK. As part of a smaller union, the UK, we lack many of the fiscal and monetary tools that other smaller nations can use to boost their resilience. Now, Fidel Cabood covered Scotland's structural and institutional weaknesses in an interview he did with SCOTONOMICS. Now, have a listen as he describes our infrastructure and much of our institutional design as colonial in nature.
Well, it's fascinating once you start looking at, old colonies, from more than a century ago, and how the structural, sometimes even the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure of the country is still perpetuating the same colonial relationships. And one of those is usually the actual physical infrastructure for extracting natural resources, transporting and shipping them to the mainland, right, of the colony. So if you tell me that Scotland today, or Scotland during, the colonial times, was a source of extraction of materials to go into England, but after, a couple of hundred years, the Scottish economy was so transformed and became so independent that it has its own infrastructure, for example, ports to ship to the global economy on its own terms. Then I'll tell you the Scottish economy is probably partially decolonized. But if you tell me that Scotland still uses the same roads to ship resources to the same destination in England, then that tells me that partly the Scottish economy is still structurally tied in colonial relationships with England. If you tell me that Scotland has its own independence currency, right, with its own independent monetary policy and fiscal policy, then I tell you it's probably decolonized. But if you tell me it still uses the same colonial currency with the same more or less colonial constraints, then yeah, you still have colonial structures. If you tell me that Scotland has now independently developed its own resources for its own benefits, for its own food sovereignty and energy sovereignty on its own terms as basic pillars of development, because no country can function without food, without fuel, then I'll tell you, yeah, Scotland is probably decolonized and independent. But if Scotland is still food dependent by design, and if Scotland's most of its energy, and it has huge energy potential, is destined for extraction and export rather than as an input for industrialization and development and value addition in Scotland, then I'll tell you Scotland still probably follows the same colonial patterns that you see in many parts of the global south.
Observations about our physical infrastructure, such as ports, are really worrying when you consider the role that exports play in our current economic strategy and the role that underpins the current strategy for an independent Scotland. Well, that strategy, in short, the current administration's growth strategy for Scotland is an export-led one. Now, this silver bullet is sending more of what we produce abroad. Now, during a SCOTONOMICS session at Holyrood, the economist and current Scottish Just Transition Commissioner, Anne Pettifor, challenged the role of export-led growth for Scotland. Here is Anne during our Economics for the Real World session in Leith, where she repeated that message.
The problem with that is, with an export-oriented economy, and I'm back at Scotland on this question, the people who benefit from that are the 1%. The 1% are engaged in the export sector. The 99% are working at home in public sector or in SMEs and so on and so forth. And when you have the structure of the global economy like that, what you're doing is you're creating differences within countries. So the 1% do very well, the 99% not doing very well. But also between countries, because you're building up deficits in one part of the world and surpluses in the other part of the world. So the thing is that this is a huge, big structural problem. And so Scotland should not, in my view, have the ambition to become a surplus country, to become an export-oriented country. The ambition should be to do what is necessary to give the people of Scotland a decent standard of life and to end this massive imbalances between the top 1% and the rest of us, basically. And that would then, in turn, help to stabilize the global economy. So I just warn us against this whole idea of having a currency and exporting and seeing our way through this global economy, which has caused so much. Now, those imbalances between countries, if you think of China has a massive surplus, the United States has a massive deficit, Germany has a massive surplus, Portugal or Greece has had a massive deficit. And those imbalances have caused global tensions and are leading to war. We've got to change, we've got to transform that whole system. We've got to learn from John Hobson.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say, when you said that at Parliament earlier about exports and Scotland really shouldn't be a huge exporter, Ivan McKee almost had a heart attack. He's working on the Scottish Government export strategy. So eyes were raised, and that was the whole point of us having that event at Holyrood.
It's not all negative though. Many positive aspects create a wonderful foundation for a resilient economy. We are a very well educated population. We have substantial natural resources. Our products and services are known worldwide, and we have a massive diaspora. We are one of the wealthier nations in Europe. We've got well-developed legal and political systems. We actually start in the fast lane. Now, during our interview with Fidel, he highlighted how every African nation would welcome Scotland's starting position when it was considering to be more resilient. Now, we are better positioned than most nations to consider and improve our resilience, but we have to start to do that. To become more resilient, the Scottish Government must focus on certain types of sovereignty. Now, unfortunately, we can do nothing on the most important type of sovereignty, monetary sovereignty, as we are stuck in our position as currency users within the UK. But we can do so much more on food, energy and technology sovereignty. And these three must be at the top of the list for policymakers. Here is Fidel again talking about the importance of technological sovereignty.
It's about the control of technology. Right, so you might look around the Scottish economy and see quite a bit of sophisticated technology around, Like, who's producing this technology? Who's owning it? Who controls access to this technology? Is there actual transfer of technology to Scottish company, to Scottish know-how, to build the foundation for research and development of made in Scotland technology that will actually have global influence? Then that tells you that you're still operating, at the bottom of the hierarchy of the colonial structure in today's global economy. And you're still the source of extraction of wealth, because you're a consumer of technology, you're a consumer of products that are made and owned by other nations or other corporations. So it's fascinating when you look at some economies in Europe that still operate under these colonial rules, and the rules of international trade and investment architecture are designed to perpetuate this, because these are rules that don't allow for transfer of technology, for example, right? You can only buy it or rent it from the countries that dominate this technology.
Dale highlights the structural challenges and the issues we face. Now, most of these issues are obscured by our reliance on GDP as a target. Now, GDP hides all manner of ills. We must stop focusing on growth and start focusing on how to make our economy and society more resilient. And we must start to do that now. Now, I want to break down 3 foundational areas that underpin a resilient economy. Power must be shared equally for the Scottish economy to be more resilient. Our economy must be more diverse, with various organisations and systems at work, and it must be more equal. Reducing poverty and inequality must take on a mission-style objective in a resilient economy. So, taking each one of these in turn, let's first look at power. Resilience is built by owning and controlling the main factors of production and giving much more power back to labour. Critically, citizens in Scotland must have more control over land and its use. This is perhaps the single most important policy area to address. Understanding power is key. We become much more resilient when we all have more of a say in Scotland's economic decisions and its future. At the moment, people are too detached from the institutions that make crucial decisions in Scotland, and I don't just mean the parliaments in London and Holyrood, but also at a local level. We must develop institutions that allow us to engage more with our economy. Now, next is the importance of a diverse approach. Ownership of capital assets must be diverse. Resilience also comes from having a variety of possible solutions. We must move away from the centralised institutions, especially markets that dominate Scotland and the UK. A prime example would be the power of the large supermarkets in Scotland. Here's Mark Blythe again.
Right, so if your food security is based upon a company whose unofficial motto is taking every shitty city over, Tesco, right? Then you know that you've outsourced a lot of your responsibilities to the private sector.
Tesco and all the others are not based in Scotland, and yet we have effectively outsourced our whole food supply chain to these foreign-based, profit-driven multinationals. Now, the same can be said about our energy, generation and supply. Now, as we create the conditions for a resilient economy, it's important to consider that there is no one best way to manage Scotland's resources. Now, Eleanor Ostrom, the political scientist and first female winner of the Nobel Memorial Prize for Economics, re-examined the theory of the tragedy of the commons, and she found that diverse ecosystems were less prone to overuse, and the ability of communities to self-organise was a key to their success. Now, this is true of other complex systems like our economy, and it supports Donella Mello's insights that self-organisation creates resilience. Now, finally, a more balanced economy in terms of income and wealth distribution is a much more resilient one. Poverty must soon be a thing of the past. Now, unable to create new net financial wealth, a gift only available to the UK and other currency issuing governments, the Scottish Government must challenge every Scot to join them to eliminate poverty across Scotland. With a focus on redistribution, inequality and the many ills that follow in its wake, like higher crime rates, higher mental and physical illness, lower life expectancy, will disappear. A resilient economy is one that we can work towards now. And this fits squarely with a wellbeing economy, a just transition, and it can be underpinned by concepts such as community wealth building. And there is a huge amount of support that's already out there when the Scottish Government is ready to take this approach. We don't have to wait for independence to make our economy more resilient. We can start that now. Now, if you're interested in following the work of Scotonomics in this area, please like and subscribe to our channel and sign up for the newsletter and the comments, and look out for our next video. There is an alternative.